The town of Dusty Hollow had never been kind to those who carried scars, and for Clara, scars were all she had left. Once, she had walked its wooden streets with laughter on her lips and dreams in her eyes, but those days had been buried with her husband, or perhaps with the pieces of her heart he had shattered. Now, every step she took felt weighted with judgment. Every glance from a neighbor sharpened like the edge of a knife. They said she was cursed. They whispered in the mercantile, muttered it behind closed doors, and sometimes even spat it boldly when they passed her on the road. Bad luck follows her, they hissed. First her husband's death, then her family turning her away. No wonder she's alone. Clara pretended not to hear, but every word carved deeper into the hollow place where her hope used to be. That evening, she sat on the creaking porch of the crumbling cabin she rented at the far end of town. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted with strokes of amber and violet as the sun lowered itself behind the hills. A cool wind brushed across her face, tugging strands of chestnut hair loose from her braid. Her hands, raw from washing laundry for coins, lay limp in her lap. She looked out at the horizon and wondered if anyone would notice if she disappeared altogether. Clara remembered the day her husband rode away for the last time. He had promised a return, his voice dripping with the same honeyed charm that had once fooled her into believing she was cherished. Instead, he had run off with another woman, leaving Clara not just abandoned but disgraced. A year later, news came of his death in some nameless skirmish. People pitied him, not her. In their eyes, Clara was a common thread in every tragedy, a living curse. The gossip stung more than she admitted. Women at the well would pause their chatter when she approached, their eyes darting with mock sympathy. Men would look her over, some with contempt, others with a hunger that made her skin crawl. No matter where she went, Clara was either invisible or scorned. Both felt like a slow kind of death. Tonight was no different. Earlier that day at the market, she had heard one of the shopkeepers mutter, "She'll never be wanted, not by any decent man." The words had clung to her like burrs, scratching at her heart even as she tried to brush them away. Sitting alone now, she replayed them over and over until they blurred with every cruel phrase she had ever endured. She pressed her palms together tightly, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to. "Lord, I don't ask for love. I don't even ask for happiness. Just let me have peace. Just one corner of this world where no one curses my name." Her voice cracked, and tears she fought all day finally slipped down her cheeks. She wiped them quickly, as if the world might be watching even in her solitude. The porch boards groaned beneath her as she shifted, hugging her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. The cabin behind her was small, little more than 4 walls and a roof that leaked when it rained. Still, it was all she could afford after the town's wealthier families refused to hire her for respectable work. Laundry, mending, scrubbing floors, that was all she was trusted with now. She told herself it was enough. But at night the silence mocked her. As the last light of day bled into darkness, Clara's gaze fixed on the lanterns flickering in town. She could almost hear the laughter spilling from the saloon, the boots stomping to music, the clink of glasses raised in cheer. Once, she might have been welcomed inside such a place. Now, she wouldn't dare cross the threshold. The town had judged her, and Clara had sentenced herself to solitude, her chest tightened with the weight of memories. She remembered her father's face when he had slammed the door after her husband's betrayal came to light. "You've shamed this family enough. Don't come back." She remembered her mother's silence, the way she had turned her back instead of meeting her daughter's eyes. Abandoned by blood, abandoned by vows. What did that make her but a ghost walking among the living? The wind howled softly through the dry grass, carrying with it a loneliness that seeped into Clara's bones. She leaned against the porch post, staring into darkness where the land stretched unbroken. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and dust, life went on. Cattle still grazed, wagons still rolled, children still laughed. But in Clara's world, time had frozen the moment her heart was shattered. For a long while, she didn't move, only sat with the silence as her companion. Then, as the first stars pierced the night sky, Clara whispered to herself, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am cursed." Her voice trembled with exhaustion, but there was no one to hear, no one to argue otherwise. And so the broken widow remained on the porch, wrapped in shadows and sorrow, unaware that fate was already stirring on the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a horse's steady hooves echoed against the earth, drawing closer, carrying with it the shadow of a man whose silence carried strength. A man who would soon cross her path and change the whispers of her broken past into something she never thought she deserved. The next morning dawned clear, but Clara woke with the same heaviness pressing against her chest. She wrapped her shawl tight and headed into town, carrying a small basket of mended clothes she had worked on all night. The streets were already buzzing, wagon wheels rattling, men shouting greetings, women gathering outside the mercantile. Dust rose with every step, and Clara kept her head down, hoping to slip past unseen. But in Dusty Hollow, whispers always found her before she found peace. A group of women stood by the well, their chatter pausing the moment Clara passed. Their eyes trailed over her worn dress and tired face, and one of them, bold and sharp-tongued, muttered loud enough for all to hear, "There goes the cursed widow. No wonder no man will ever claim her." The others tittered behind their hands. Clara's cheeks burned, and she quickened her steps, pretending the words didn't slice through her like blades. From across the street, another voice joined in, a ranch hand leaning against a saloon's post. Maybe she should just leave town. Dusty Hollow's got no use for a woman like that. His laugh was cruel, and a few others echoed it. Clara's eyes stung, but she forced herself forward. The basket in her arms felt heavier than iron, and she whispered inwardly, "Don't cry. Not here, not where they can see." But before the mocking could swell further, a new sound broke through the noise, the steady thud of boots against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Heads turned, and the crowd's laughter faltered. A tall man, broad-shouldered and rugged from the trail, had stopped near the well. Dust clung to his coat, and the brim of his weathered hat shadowed his face. He didn't say much, didn't need to. His very presence commanded a silence the town rarely knew. This was Ethan Walker, a cowboy known to some, a stranger to others. His story was whispered too, though far less often. Years ago, he had lost a wife and child in a fever that swept through the valley. Since then, Ethan lived on the outskirts, working cattle, mending fences, riding into town only when necessity forced him. People called him a man of few words, but those who knew him understood. Every word he did speak carried weight. Clara dared to glance at him, startled by the way his gaze, steady, calm, unflinching, settled on her. Not with pity, not with scorn, just acknowledgement, as though he saw her pain but chose not to use it against her. For a heartbeat, Clara froze, caught in that quiet strength. Then she lowered her head quickly, expecting him to join the town in its cruel chorus. Instead, his voice came low and even, carrying across the still air like the strike of a hammer. "You don't deserve this." The words weren't loud, but they rippled through the street like a gunshot. Every whisper died. The women at the well shifted uneasily, suddenly busy with their buckets. The ranch hand at the saloon muttered something under his breath and turned away. No one wanted to stand against Ethan Walker, not when he'd made his stance so clear. Clara blinked, stunned. For the first time in years, anyone had spoken in her defense. She wanted to thank him, but the lump in her throat held her silent. She managed only a small nod, clutching her basket tighter as if it might anchor her shaking hands. Ethan didn't linger to bask in attention. He simply adjusted the brim of his hat and stepped aside, allowing Clara to pass unhindered. His silence was louder than all the gossip, his few words stronger than the crowd's cruel laughter. For Clara, that moment etched itself deep into her heart, a flicker of light in a life too long shadowed. As she walked on, her steps unsteady, she replayed his words over and over. "You don't deserve this." Simple, strong. And for the first time, Clara wondered if maybe, just maybe, someone in this world believed she was more than a curse. Ethan, meanwhile, stood still for a while longer, watching as Clara disappeared down the road. His expression gave nothing away, but inside, he recognized something in her he knew all too well. The weight of grief, the sting of being abandoned by the very people meant to love you. Perhaps that was why he had spoken at all. Not out of heroism, but out of understanding. As the sun climbed higher and the town returned to its bustle, Ethan turned away and walked back toward his horse tethered at the edge of town. He didn't look back, but the words he had spoken lingered in the air like a vow, one that neither he nor Clara could yet understand, but both would carry forward. And in that moment, though no one realized it, a bond had been set in motion. Two broken souls, one silenced by grief, the other scorned by the world, had just taken their first step towards something neither had thought possible: healing. Clara's footsteps echoed faintly on the dusty road as the day stretched into evening. She had no real destination, just wandering past shuttered houses and the edges of the mercantile until her legs ached. Home was gone, family scattered, and the little shack she had rented had been claimed by the landlord after she failed to make the last payment. Now, she was little more than a shadow drifting through a town that had already decided her worth. Hungry, exhausted, and with nowhere left to turn, she sank onto a weathered bench outside the abandoned blacksmith shop, clutching her basket to her chest as though it might guard her from the loneliness gnawing at her. From the far end of the street, the steady sound of boots and the soft jingle of reins broke the stillness. Clara looked up, startled, and saw Ethan Walker leading his bay horse along the dirt road. He paused when his eyes fell on her, a lone woman sitting against the twilight, her face pale, her body sagging with defeat. There was no mockery in his expression, no judgment, just the same quiet strength she had felt earlier when he had silenced the gossip. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan's voice, low and steady, cut through the evening air. "You'll be safe at my ranch." Clara blinked, unsure she had heard right. Men didn't offer safety, not in her experience. Safety always came with a price: mockery, demands, or betrayal. She studied him, wary, but his gaze didn't waver. It held no hunger, no hidden expectation, only a simple offer, plain as the dust on his boots. Her heart pounded. She faltered, her voice small. "Why would you care?" Ethan adjusted his hat, his eyes moving briefly to the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and crimson. Because no one should face this world alone. That was all he said. Nothing more, nothing less. Before Clara could think better of it, he extended his hand. Not forceful, just there, waiting, and against every instinct that told her to run, she placed her trembling fingers in his. The wagon ride began under a sky washed with fading light. Ethan's horse pulled them steady across the long desert road, wheels crunching against gravel, the silence between them as heavy as it was fragile. Clara kept her shawl wrapped tightly around her, staring out at the endless stretch of sand and scrub. Each rise of the barren land felt like her past. Dry, unyielding, a place where nothing good could take root. Ethan didn't fill the quiet with unnecessary words. He simply guided the reins, his eyes fixed ahead, his jaw set against the wind. And yet in that silence, Clara sensed something more, something she couldn't name. It wasn't coldness. It was understanding, as if the man beside her carried wounds of his own, hidden deep beneath the steady calm he wore like armor. At one point, the wagon jolted over a rut, and Clara clutched aside, her breath catching. Ethan glanced her way, steady and unhurried. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded quickly, embarrassed at her own fragility, but the concern in his eyes lingered, quiet but real, before he turned back to the road. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a vast emptiness reflecting everything Clara felt inside. She thought of the names she'd been called: cursed, worthless, unwanted, and they echoed like a hollow wind brushing across the barren land. For years she had believed them, maybe still did. Yet, sitting beside this silent cowboy, she wondered for the first time if she might survive them. Her gaze drifted to his hands on the reins, strong, scarred, yet steady. Hands that worked the land, that bore the weight of loss, and yet still reached out to offer someone else a place of refuge. She didn't understand it, didn't understand him, but some part of her, fragile and frightened, wanted to trust that maybe, just maybe, his offer of safety was real. As the stars began to prick the sky, the ranch came into view, a lonely shape against a vast desert night. A wooden fence, a dimly lit cabin, and a faint outline of a barn standing sentinel in the distance. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but to Clara, It looked like the first place in years that wasn't dripping with disdain. The wagon rolled to a stop. Ethan set the reins aside and glanced at her once more. "Come on," he said quietly, not commanding, not coaxing, just offering. Clara hesitated, her heart trembling like a leaf in the wind. And then, with a breath that felt like both surrender and hope, she stepped down from the wagon onto ground that might finally hold her. For the first time in a long time, Clara wasn't running away. She was being led somewhere, and though she didn't yet understand why, she knew this much. The silence of the desert had brought her to a place where her brokenness wasn't mocked, but quietly, perhaps, given a chance to mend. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and smoke when Clara stepped inside. The door creaked softly behind her, closing out the desert night and its endless, cold emptiness. For a moment she froze near the threshold, unsure if she had stepped into safety or into yet another trap disguised as kindness. The wooden floors gleamed faintly in the lamplight, swept clean, and the air carried none of the suffocating weight of men's voices or lingering threats. It was quiet here, so quiet it unnerved her. Ethan set his hat on a peg by the door and moved with unhurried steps, his boots thudding gently against the boards. Without glancing back, he spoke in that same calm voice that seemed to bear the weight of the earth itself. "I've got a room ready for you. It isn't much, but it's yours." Clara's breath caught. Yours. The word echoed like something foreign, as though it did not belong to her life. He led her down a short hallway, stopping at a door near the back of the cabin. When he pushed it open, a faint warmth spilled out, a small fire flickering on the hearth, a bed neatly made with clean linens, a folded quilt resting at its edge. On the nightstand sat a simple oil lamp and a jug of water, fresh and waiting. Everything about the room spoke of effort, not extravagance, but thought. Clara stepped inside, her eyes wide, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the quilt. The fabric smelled of lavender and sun. She swallowed hard, unable to reconcile what she saw with the life she had known. Rooms that carried chains of expectation, walls that held secrets of cruelty. She turned toward him, confusion etched in her face. Why are you doing this?" Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely over his chest. His gaze was steady but not invasive. He answered simply, as though the truth required no embellishment. "You owe me nothing." The word struck her harder than any insult ever had. She had always owed something: her body, her silence, her obedience, her dignity. Every offer of kindness had been laced with demands. But here was a man saying the opposite, standing in his own house and telling her she was not bound to repay him. She stared at him, searching for the hidden snare, the price she had missed. There was none, just his quiet presence and a truth that felt too heavy to hold. Her throat tightened, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She turned away quickly, unwilling to let him see her unravel. She set her basket down by the bed and clutched the edge of the quilt as though it were a lifeline. "I don't understand," she whispered to herself. Ethan didn't press. He didn't step closer, didn't offer the empty comfort of words. He simply gave a nod, tipped the brim of his hat, and said, "Rest now. You're safe here." Then he left, the door closing softly behind him. For a long while, Clara stood alone in the room, staring at the flames dancing in the hearth. Safe. The word felt like a lie her heart wanted desperately to believe. Slowly, she sat on the bed. The mattress gave gently under her weight, not the hard floorboards or straw pallets she had grown used to. She touched the quilt again, running her fingers over the stitching. Each seam reminding her that someone had once sewn it with care. Care, something she had not known for years. Her reflection caught in the darkened window pane, and for an instant she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Hollow-eyed, weary, yet sitting in a room untouched by chains. Could it be true? Could there be a life where kindness existed without cost? Outside, the wind swept across the ranch, rattling the fence posts and whistling through the trees. The sound should have been lonely, yet here it felt protective, as though the land itself stood guard around the cabin. The silence wasn't threatening, but steady like a shield. Clara pulled the quilt around her shoulders and lay down. The firelight flickered across the ceiling, painting soft patterns that lulled her. For the first time in years, sleep came without dread without the weight of fear pressing against her chest. And somewhere in that fragile silence, Clara realized something had shifted. A door had opened, not just in the cabin, but in her heart. For the first time in a long, painful journey, she had been given a room without chains. Night pressed heavy against the cabin walls, the silence broken only by the faint crackle of dying embers in the hearth. Clara lay beneath the quilt, but sleep refused to come. Instead, shadows from the past clawed their way back into her mind. The insults rang clear as if whispered right by her ear. Cursed woman. Bad luck. Ugly. Worthless. She clenched her fists under the covers, her body stiff as the voices grew louder in memory, each one stabbing deeper than the last. Her breath came shallow, uneven. She saw flashes. Her late husband turning away in disgust. Neighbors laughing behind their hands. Relatives spitting words sharper than whips. Betrayal burned hottest of all. The moment she realized those she trusted most would rather watch her fall than lift her. The ghost did not leave when she closed her eyes. They followed her into every corner of her mind. Unable to bear it, Clara slipped out of bed and stood before the small mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The dim lamplight caught her reflection. She almost didn't recognize the hollow cheeks, the tired eyes, the faint scars that time hadn't softened. For a long moment, she just stared. Then, with trembling fingers, she touched her face as if confronting a stranger. "This is me," she whispered hoarsely. "Broken, unwanted." But even as the words left her lips, she felt the weight of them, how they weren't truly hers but borrowed from years of cruelty. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, tears sliding down her cheeks. She hated the woman staring back, yet somewhere deep inside, a fragile spark whispered that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't beyond saving. Behind the door, Ethan had heard her restless steps. He didn't intrude, didn't knock, didn't break the fragile boundary she needed to face her ghosts. Instead, he waited in the hall for a long while, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed by memories of his own. He knew that kind of silence, the kind where pain ate at you louder than screams ever could. Finally, with steady hands, he set a folded blanket against her door. Beside it, he placed a small tray, a bowl of warm stew, a loaf of bread, and a cup of water. No note, no words. Just a quiet offering of comfort. Then he walked away, the weight of his boots fading down the hall. Clara found it later when her tears had slowed. She opened the door to see the blanket and food waiting like a lifeline in the dark. Her chest tightened as she bent to pick them up. No demands, no questions, no pitying words. Just kindness, left silently for her to take or leave. She carried the tray inside and sat at the small wooden table. Her hands shook as she tore a piece of bread and dipped it into the stew. The warmth spread through her chest, softening something she hadn't realized was frozen solid. For the first time in years, she ate without fear of the next blow, without dread of the next insult. Later, she pulled the blanket over her shoulders, the fabric holding a warmth that felt deeper than fire. She sat by the window, looking out at the endless night sky. The stars seemed distant, but not unreachable. She whispered into the dark, as though testing the words aloud. Why would a stranger care? The question lingered, unanswered. Yet the quiet presence of Ethan's kindness was enough for tonight. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe that not every hand reached out to hurt. Some, perhaps, were meant to heal. And as the night wore on, the ghosts still whispered, but their voices were softer. They no longer owned all of her. The morning sun spilled across the ranch, painting the fields in gold. Clara stood hesitantly near the porch, clutching her shawl as Ethan saddled his horse. The quiet rhythm of leather straps and the low snort of the animal felt strangely comforting. She had expected tension, maybe even demands in return for his shelter. But instead, she found only silence, a silence that wasn't cruel but steady, like the earth beneath her feet. Ethan noticed her watching, his hands pausing for a moment before he spoke in his low, even voice. I protect. I don't hurt. The words came simply, without flourish, but Clara felt them settle deep inside her like a stone in water. He didn't look at her when he said it, as if the vow wasn't meant to impress, but to remind himself of the line he would never cross. That day, Clara wandered into the barn. Dust floated in the sunbeams, and the scent of hay filled the air. Ethan was repairing a broken fence post. His sleeves rolled up, sweat tracing down his brow. She lingered, unsure she belonged here, until he nodded toward the tools. "Could use another pair of hands, if you're willing." His tone carried no command, just quiet respect. At first, she only fetched nails and held board steady, her movements awkward and unsure. Yet every time she did, Ethan looked at her and said softly, "Thank you." No man had ever thanked her for simple things. The words felt strange, like a gift she didn't know how to unwrap. Over the next few days, Clara found herself helping more. She brushed down the horses, their warmth calming her hands as they nuzzled against her palms. She carried buckets of water, mended torn cloth, and even learned to scatter feed for chickens. Each task was small, but each time Ethan's voice followed with that same gentle gratitude. "Thank you." The rhythm of ranch life slowly seeped into her bones. The creak of fences, the call of cattle across the fields, the scent of fresh earth after morning chores. It was a life she'd never imagined herself part of. And yet, with each passing hour, she felt less like a guest and more like someone who belonged. One afternoon, while leading a stubborn colt back into the corral, Clara nearly stumbled. The rope slipped through her hands, burning her skin, before panic could rise. Ethan's steady hand covered hers, guiding the rope with quiet control. His presence was firm but never forceful, his strength used only to steady, never to bind. When the colt finally calmed, Clara looked at him, her breath quick. For the first time, she believed his words. "I protect, I don't hurt." They weren't just a principle, they were who he was. That evening, she sat by the fire, her mind heavy with thoughts. The voices of the past still whispered, but now another voice echoed louder. Ethan's steady gratitude, his quiet code of honor. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and allowed herself a fragile smile. Perhaps trust wasn't built in grand gestures, but in these small, steady moments, one thank you at a time. And for the first time in years, Clara felt the faint beginnings of safety grow roots in her heart. The next morning, Clara tried her hand in the kitchen. The ranch stove was old, its iron top temperamental, but she was determined to cook something simple. Flour dusted her hair, and the dough stuck stubbornly to her fingers. She muttered under her breath, unaware that Ethan leaned quietly against the doorway, arms crossed, watching. When the pan suddenly smoked and the biscuits turned black, she jumped back with a small yelp. The sight of her wide eyes and flour-covered face almost pulled a smile from him. Clara tried again, this time adding too much milk, which sent the mixture spilling over the edge of the bowl. She groaned, pushing her hair back, leaving a streak of flour on her cheek. Ethan finally stepped forward, his voice calm but with the faintest trace of amusement. The fire's supposed to cook the food, not scare it. Clara stared at him, stunned, and then, to her own surprise, a laugh bubbled out, soft at first, then brighter, freer. It was the first true laugh she'd allowed herself in years. Later that day, she wandered into the stables. A young horse, spirited and restless, stomped its hooves as she approached. Clara hesitated, her hand trembling before it touched the animal's mane. To her relief, the horse lowered its head, nuzzling against her palm. She smiled, a genuine warmth in her chest, as the creature whinnied softly. Ethan stood nearby, silent but observant, his eyes softening at the sight of her finding peace in the animal's trust. That evening, as the sun lowered, Clara carried water toward the corral, but tripped on a loose board. The bucket toppled, splashing both of them with cold water. She gasped, covering her mouth in horror, but Ethan didn't scold. Instead, his lips twitched in the faintest smile, and she burst into laughter again, the sound echoing across the quiet ranch like music. For Ethan, those moments stirred something deep. He had lived in silence for so long, his life reduced to chores and shadows of memory. But seeing Clara laugh, hearing that sound break through years of pain, it warmed a part of him he thought had died. He didn't join her laughter aloud, but inside, something heavy lifted. By the fire that night, Clara wrapped herself in the quilt, still chuckling softly at the thought of her kitchen disaster. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider in this place. She felt alive, And across the room, Ethan sat quietly, staring into the flames, his heart lighter than it had been in years. In that silence, neither of them said a word. But they didn't need to. The sparks of life had returned, flickering gently between them, reminding them both that maybe, just maybe, they weren't too broken to feel joy again. The peace of the ranch didn't last long. Clara had begun to feel the warmth of laughter again, her heart lighter with each passing day. But rumors in the nearby town were growing darker. When she went into town for supplies, she could feel the whispers slicing through the air like knives. She's the cursed widow. Nothing good comes from her. Others muttered. No wonder her husband's dead. She brings ruin wherever she goes. Clara kept her head low, but their words dug into old wounds. That evening, as the sky turned blood red with sunset, a group of riders appeared at the edge of the town. Dust rose around them, and the people scattered, murmuring in fear. Leading them was an outlaw with a cruel smile and eyes that gleamed like steel. At his side rode two men Clara recognized instantly, her estranged relatives, the same men who had once called her useless, cursed, unwanted. They had returned, not with kindness, but with greed. The outlaw dismounted, his spurs striking the ground with a sharp clang. His voice carried across the square, low and venomous. This woman belongs to us. She's family, and family debts must be paid. Clara froze, her chest tight, but before she could speak, one of her relatives sneered. She'll come with us. The ranch, the cattle, whatever she's got, it's ours by blood. Clara's knees weakened, the world spinning. Old fears clawed at her. She had no strength to fight them, not after years of being told she was worthless. But before the outlaw could step closer, a shadow moved forward, silent, steady, immovable. Ethan stood tall, his jaw set, his hand resting near his holster though he hadn't drawn his gun. His voice, calm but edged with steel, cut through the murmurs. She's not leaving. The outlaw narrowed his eyes, studying him. You stand in the way of her blood, cowboy? You'd choose her over your own skin? His tone dripped with menace, and his hand hovered near his revolver. The crowd held its breath. Clara's heart pounded so hard she thought it would break through her chest. Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped closer, shielding Clara behind him. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a vow. She's not leaving, not while I breathe. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shifting of horses and the nervous whispers of townsfolk. Clara's eyes burned with tears. No one had ever stood for her like this. No one had ever faced danger to keep her safe. She had always been one abandoned, the one mocked, the one cast aside. But now, this man, this cowboy scarred by his own grief, was willing to risk everything for her. The outlaw smirked, though his fingers twitched with frustration. Then it seems, he hissed, we'll have to take what's ours, over your dead body. The threat hung like a blade in the air, but Ethan didn't waver. He planted his boots firmly in the dirt, a wall of quiet strength. Clara clutched the edge of his coat, trembling, realizing for the first time that someone had chosen to fight for her instead of against her. As the standoff stretched, the townsfolk watched from their doorways, waiting for the gunfire that might spill. But for Clara, the world had already shifted. She no longer felt like the cursed woman everyone whispered about. For the first time, she felt like someone worth protecting, someone worth fighting for. The night after the confrontation weighed heavy on Clara's chest. The outlaw's words echoed in her mind, tangled with the cruel laughter of her relatives. Though Ethan had stood firm, though no bullets had flown, Clara's body trembled as if she'd barely survived a war. Inside the ranch house, the fire flickered, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Clara sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, her face buried in her hands. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to break. Silent sobs shook her shoulders until her voice cracked out loud. Why would you fight for someone like me? Her words weren't just a question. They were a confession. Every insult, every betrayal she'd endured had carved the belief that she was unworthy of love or protection. She couldn't comprehend why Ethan, a man with no bond to her, would risk his life standing between her and death. Ethan lingered at the doorway for a long moment, watching her trembling figure. His hat hung loosely in his hands, his boots dusty from the day's turmoil. Then he stepped inside, slow and careful, as though she might shatter at the wrong touch. His voice came low, steady and certain. "Because you matter." Clara lifted her face, tears streaking her cheeks. She searched his eyes for mockery, for pity, but found none. Instead, she saw a depth she hadn't allowed herself to believe in, a quiet certainty that she was worth more than her scars, her past, or the names they called her. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out something small. It was a locket, simple silver, weathered by time but polished with care. He held it out to her. "This belonged to my mother. She wore it through every storm, every hardship. She told me once, a person's worth isn't decided by the world, but by the strength they carry inside." He pressed it gently into her hands. "You'll never walk in fear again. Not while I'm here." Clara's fingers trembled as she clasped the locket, its cool weight both strange and grounding. For years, every gift she had known had come with chains, demands, conditions, debts. But this was different. There was no price, no hidden cruelty. Just a vow, silent yet unshakable. Overcome, Clara stood abruptly, and before she could stop herself, she leaned into him. Ethan's arms instinctively wrapped around her, firm yet tender, like a shield against every shadow that haunted her. Her tears soaked into his shirt, but he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply held her, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, as if promising her with every breath that she was safe. For the first time in her life, Clara allowed herself to believe it. In his embrace, she wasn't the cursed widow or the unwanted burden. She was simply Clara, a woman worth holding, worth protecting, worth loving. And in that silent vow, sealed not by words but by the strength of his arms, she felt something bloom within her that she thought had long since died. Hope. Spring crept quietly across the land, weaving color into every corner of the once silent ranch. The earth, which had felt as weary as Clara's heart, began to stir with life. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the soil. The cattle grew strong and healthy, and the fences stood tall after weeks of careful repair. For the first time in years, laughter occasionally echoed across the fields, soft, hesitant at first, but real. Each sunrise seemed brighter, as if the land itself had been waiting for Clara and Ethan to breathe life back into it. The ranch was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a home. Clara awoke each morning with a sense of belonging she had thought forever lost. The echoes of her old life, the insults, the loneliness, the fear, faded like ghosts that no longer had power over her. Instead, she carried the warmth of Ethan's steady presence, his quiet gratitude in every small thing she did, his unwavering promise that she was safe. One morning, as she set bread on the table, she paused and realized something startling. She was no longer broken. She was cherished. The days unfolded in rhythms of healing. Clara worked beside Ethan in the fields, her hands no longer trembling as they once did. She brushed the horses, tended to the chickens, and found herself humming as she worked, a sound she hadn't made since girlhood. Sometimes, she would catch Ethan watching her from across the corral. He never interrupted, never demanded, only smiled in that small, almost hidden way that told her he saw her joy, and it was enough to make his day whole. One evening, after finishing supper, Clara wandered outside. The porch swing creaked gently as she sat, the cool air wrapping around her. The horizon blazed with colors of red, gold, and violet, a reminder that beauty still bloomed after storms. Ethan joined her, settling quietly at her side. They didn't speak at first, but their silence was comfortable now, no longer weighed down by pain. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining naturally, as if they had always belonged together. Clara turned to him, her voice soft but sure. "Do you realize what you've done?" Ethan looked at her, puzzled. She smiled faintly. "You didn't just give me a roof. You gave me back pieces of myself I thought were gone forever." Her words trembled with emotion, but her eyes shone with strength. Ethan didn't apply with speeches or grand gestures. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently, letting her know he understood. The ranch around them seemed to mirror their journey. Where once weeds had choked the soil, fresh grass stretched in emerald waves. Where once silence had been suffocating, the sounds of life returned. Birds singing in the rafters, cattle lowing contentedly, wind whispering through repaired fences. The land itself healed because they had chosen to heal. Together, Clara rested her head lightly against Ethan's shoulder. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of leaning on someone. She wasn't afraid of being too much or not enough. She wasn't afraid of breaking again. Because here with him, she wasn't fragile glass waiting to shatter. She was a woman loved not despite her scars, but alongside them. The sun dipped lower, and a quiet stillness fell over the porch. Ethan's voice finally broke the silence, deep and steady, almost a whisper. You've carried enough pain for a lifetime. From here on, let me carry it with you. Clara closed her eyes, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. She realized then that the vow he had given her wasn't just words. It was a way of life he had already begun living. As dawn stretched its first golden fingers across the sky the next morning, Clara and Ethan stood together on the porch once more. The world felt new, the air filled with promise. Their hands were still clasped, their hearts beating in quiet unison. Clara looked out the horizon, the light brushing her face, and felt a strength rise within her, one she hadn't thought she would ever feel again. And when she glanced at Ethan, his steady gaze holding hers, she knew the truth with every fiber of her being. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't broken. She was loved. The final words lingered in her soul, echoing like a prayer fulfilled. I'll carry your burden, he had whispered, and in his quiet love, she found a strength that pieced her whole again.